Hello, I'm starting the recording now, um, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay, maybe computer's running a little slow. Okay, all right, everyone, we've got a lot to cover today, so I'm going to go ahead and jump in. Um, So people will be trickling in as we go, but this is the Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project. Today with Amy Gravino, we'll be discussing sexuality and the spectrum, lessons on sex, dating, and love, autism style. Um, I'm Dalton Byers with Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Supports. I'll be supporting and monitoring the chat, Q&A, things of that sort today for this webinar. If you have any questions or having any technical issues, feel free to drop those in the chat or in the Q&A section, and I'll bring those up or resolve them as they're relevant. For reference, the Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project develops and presents resources that assist individuals with autism in their transition from secondary education to post-secondary education or employment. And ICSPS has been a part of Illinois State University and the College of Education since 1977 and designs and delivers professional development, technical assistance, and program improvement strategies for career, technical, and adult education and workforce professionals. And thank you for Illinois State Board of Education for supporting this in part. I'm going to go ahead and get us some polls thrown up just so we can get some references to how many, where people are at, as well as kind of who you represent. I believe you can select multiple for who you represent. So for reference, where you're at, you can kind of see on this graphic what 1, 2, 3, 4 corresponds to the numbers on the side. Here we go. Awesome. Thank you everyone for dropping in. Looks like we're starting to get a pretty good showing throughout the whole state. Pretty evenly distributed so far with our responses. Awesome. A lot of secondary educators and community members um, in our attendees, and even one employer, which is really cool to see. Cool. Okay, I will let that end our poll and share our results. So I can kind of give you some reference, Amy, as to who we're talking to today. A lot from secondary and post-secondary and a little bit through other areas. So that's super great. Kind of jumping through these entry things, just a reference point for who you represent. This is Amy, an autism sexuality advocate and consultant, and I'll let her introduce herself more fully. I'll stop sharing my screen. Um, Excellent. I just want to, while she's doing that, thank you all for taking some time out of your day in the middle of the cold winter December to join us in this really interesting and engaging conversation. So I'll be available if you have any questions.
Thanks so much, Dalton. Let me just get this going. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here today. As Dalton said, my name is Amy Gravino, and I'll be speaking to you today about sexuality and the spectrum, lessons on sex, dating, and love, autism style. If anyone remembers the show Love American Style, there's your 1960s pop culture reference for the day. So just to go over some of the objectives of what we'll be covering in today's talk, and I wish I had more time with you. I know we don't have as much time as we would need to cover everything that involves this topic because it is so extensive. But just to give you an idea, I'm going to dispel some of the misconceptions that exist around the way relationships and sexuality are experienced by autistic people. I think a lot of these misconceptions are what prevent us from having open and honest conversations about autism and sexuality. So it's important that we kind of go through what some of those myths are and where they come from so that we can begin to have these conversations. I'm also going to highlight some of the barriers that exist to both teachers and parents focusing on sexuality skills. From the poll, it doesn't look like we have any parents here today, but this is just good information for everybody, I feel like. But what are those things that often make it difficult for us to address the subject of sexuality in school environments? And then finally, I'm going to provide a rationale for developing a sex ed curriculum for autistic young adults, and also provide some strategies for teachers and parents, and basically good stuff for anyone who supports and works with autistic young adults and teenagers. And we will have time at the end for questions, but if you have any questions throughout this presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A feature. You can also use the chat, and I know Dalton will be keeping an eye on that, and I'll keep an eye on it as well. Oh, we already have, we have a question about if the presentation will be shared. So Dalton, you can take care of that one. But yes, so feel free to use those features at any time, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. So I would say I can't see anybody, but when I give this presentation in person, I always like to ask this question and see the show of hands. And you can answer in the chat if you want, or just think it to yourself if you prefer, about who you talk to. Chat. Somebody said chat is disabled. Okay, so we don't have a working chat, so that may not be. I don't know if we want to enable chat, but if not, then we can just use the Q&A. And thank you for bringing that to my attention. So do any of you talk to your parents about sex and dating? Or probably not. Most people don't talk to their parents about sex and dating. Maybe if you're close to them. What about your siblings, right? Some people might be close to a sibling, brother or sister, you feel like you can confide in about sex and dating. I'm an only child, not applicable, but maybe you have a sibling you can talk to about it. What about a therapist or a counselor? I'm from New Jersey. Everybody has a therapist. No shame. It's okay. Right? A lot of people talk to a therapist about sex and dating. What about your friends? Now, usually when I give this presentation in person, this is where everybody's hands go up, because for most of us, our friends are who we talk to about sex and dating. For most people, neurotypical people particularly, their support system and the group of people that people rely on for these conversations are their friends. Or do you not have anyone to talk to, or not feel comfortable talking about sex and dating? Several years ago, I gave this presentation to a group of autistic college students in upstate New York, and almost every one of them raised their hand for the last one. And that's the position that many autistic people find ourselves in when it comes to this topic. Because there's so much stigma and taboo around sexuality as it relates to autism and disability, it becomes difficult for people to. Oh, thank you, Dalton. So the chat is enabled now, folks. So if you want to put something in the chat, you can use the chat feature. Thanks, Dalton, for taking care of that. But let us know if you have any other technical challenges or issues, and we'll take care of it. But yes, so this is just where, unfortunately, many autistic people find ourselves. As challenging as it is to talk about sex in our society, which I'll discuss more in a minute, it becomes even more difficult when you add autism into the equation. And this is such a big part of the human experience, right? This is how we experience the world. Your partner. Thank you, Natasha. Okay, that's a very good answer, right? A partner. So hopefully your partner's your friend, also totally. But yeah, so that's good. But sometimes, right, when it's difficult to talk to a partner about sex or dating, or if you have things that have to do with your partner, right, you need other people who are a sounding board. And so for most of us, that tends to be friends, right? But if you don't have anyone to talk to about this, it makes it so much more difficult. So, as I was saying, there's a lot of these misconceptions, right, around autism and relationships, and that contribute to why it becomes so difficult to just have a conversation even about these subjects, let alone to talk about implementing comprehensive and accurate sex education for autistic teenagers and young adults. And probably the biggest myth that contributes to this is that autistic people are all asexual or don't have sex, right? And it's an interesting thing because this myth doesn't apply to other disabled populations. When, for example, individuals with Down syndrome are often characterized as being hypersexual, or you can't put two people with Down syndrome in the room together, they'll have crazy, freaky sex. And then the opposite with autism. Some of this comes from popular culture. We think of like shows like The Big Bang Theory, Sheldon Cooper. And there are certainly people who do identify as asexual who are autistic, and that is absolutely fine. Incidentally, asexuality is a spectrum in and of itself. Identifying as asexual doesn't necessarily mean that someone doesn't have sex, although it can. But the issue is that when this becomes the dominant stereotype for a whole group of people, that's a real big problem. Um, and this also ties into that the idea of infantilization. If anyone is familiar with the term infantilization, that's where we talk about autistic adults as if they're children in big bodies, the whole kind of mental age theorem, which is, he's 25 years old with the mentality of a 7-year-old. No, he's 25 years old with the mentality of a 25-year-old who is autistic and has his particular challenges, strengths, needs, and so on. So, in actuality, autistic people do have sex. We have good sex, bad sex, mediocre sex, everything in between. We just might need some more structure and guidance when it comes to achieving our particular goals in this area. Another myth that's out there, dating an autistic guy is exactly the same as dating an autistic girl. Now, this I tend to feel like comes more from the diagnostic criteria that we use to diagnose autism, right? That criteria was largely developed observing white boys. And so that created this one kind of representation, this one picture of autism. But not everyone who's autistic fits that picture. But if we paint everyone who has this diagnosis with a broad brush, we're doing a tremendous disservice. We're ignoring the fact that, I mean, there are fundamental differences, between, girls and guys, and especially when it comes to the spectrum. And then, there are needs that we have that autistic boys don't. We are different. That's not a bad thing. But there are challenges that we as autistic girls and women face, particularly the pressures of society, which, whether it doesn't matter if you're autistic, you can still be subjected to those same pressures and the same ideas of how women are supposed to behave. So we're not the same as autistic boys, right? Plain and simple. Another myth, individuals with autism are all straight or cisgender. When discussions have happened historically around autism and sexuality, it's often been from a heteronormative perspective. But in actuality, there are as many, if not more, people on the spectrum who identify as LGBTQ than in the neurotypical population. And this could be for any number of different reasons. Just less adherence to social norms, or it could be any, number of reasons why. But the simple point is that, when we have these conversations, this is something we need to keep in mind, because this brings us to the concept of intersectionality. So if anyone's familiar with the idea of intersectionality, what that means is that we all have different pieces of our identity that come together to affect how we are perceived by the world and how the world treats us, right? So someone can be autistic and Black and gay. Someone can be autistic and a woman and trans, and like all these pieces of one's identity, are important and contribute, right, to how someone is perceived by the world, as I was saying. And so any sexual orientation or gender identity that you're going to see among the neurotypical population, you'll see among people on the spectrum. And we can't leave that out, and we can't forget that, when we talk about people wanting to be accepted for who they are as autistic individuals, that can also include wanting to be accepted as autistic and LGBTQ+. And too often those end up being mutually exclusive, because many autistic people who are LGBTQ say that they are not welcomed in LGBTQ spaces because they're autistic, and they're not welcome in autistic spaces because they're LGBTQ. So this is just a really important thing that we have to keep in mind. Another myth, autistic people only date other autistic people. I don't know if anyone has seen the show Love on the Spectrum, if you're all familiar with that. It was originally a show in Australia on Netflix, and they came over here to the US. And I was actually in talks with the producers to be the dating coach on the show, although that ended up not happening because Hollywood is going to Hollywood. That's okay. But the thing about Love on the Spectrum, there are some good things about it, certainly. But all the couples on the show, from my observation at least, are either autistic person and another autistic person, or autistic person and someone with another mental health diagnosis, whether that's OCD, ADHD, bipolar disorder, and so on. There's not really any what we would call mixed neurology couples. So an autistic person and a neurotypical person. And that's not really true to real life, right? Love, doesn't care if you have a disability. You fall in love with who you fall in love with. And autistic people do and can date all different kinds of people. I know many people on the spectrum who prefer to date someone who also is autistic, who shares that diagnosis and understands where they're coming from. I know people on the spectrum who date people who have other mental health diagnoses, as I mentioned, and I know people on the spectrum who date neurotypicals. For me, most autistic men drive me up the wall, but most men in general drive me up the wall. So what's the real big difference? But again, no limitation on who you can be with. Of course, within the legal framework, we're not talking anything that is outside of that, but within consenting adult relationships. Another myth, of course, and we're almost done with our myths, but this came up a few years ago when I was giving a presentation to a conference in Romania, actually, and someone asked me, "Do autistic people feel rejection the same way that neurotypicals do?" And I was sort of taken aback by this. And again, I'm thinking about that diagnostic criteria and this idea of, autistic people lacking empathy, supposedly. And I think that nothing could be further from the truth. Rather than nothing getting in, it's that everything gets in and we're not able to filter it out. And so we wind up shutting down as a result, and it looks like a lack of empathy, but it's really not. And rejection hurts. It doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter if you're on the spectrum or not. I have a lifetime's worth of experience with rejection. And I may not remember like the exact specifics of everything, but I remember what I felt. And they all hurt. And that's not different just because you're on the spectrum. And the last myth, and probably this is the one that I always find the most hurtful, again comes from that same place, that individuals with autism can't love. Right? Again, this goes to the idea that if emotions are not displayed in a way that is typically expected, there's an assumption that the person does not feel those emotions. Not true. Simply, absolutely not true. In actuality, people with autism are full of love. We have so much love to give. It's just a matter of finding someone who respect and honor that love. That often tends to be the problem. So sex is everywhere, right? We live in a very sexualized society. It's in our advertisements, it's on our TVs, it's used to sell things you wouldn't even think would be used to sell, and it's certainly all over the internet and social media. We're almost in a way desensitized to sexual matter. But yet at the same time, we don't have serious conversations about sex. We're very uncomfortable. Just speaking honestly and frankly about sexuality and sexual health. And that becomes even more the case, like I said before, when we add autism into the equation. So what we're going to do is keep calm and talk about sex. We're going to get past what I call the blushing cheek phase, because if you're embarrassed and uncomfortable talking about this, then the students and the individuals you support and work with are going to be uncomfortable. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the secret language of emojis. I'm going to show you a very quick little video, and then we're going to talk about the secret language of emojis. Did I enable sound? I'm sorry, if I didn't enable sound, I can fix that. Hang on. Let me redo my sharing. Okay, I will fix that, no problem. Okay, share sound. There we go. Sorry, that was my fault, folks. Here we go. Okay. Just a minute. Okay.
There's a whole kind of language.
Yes, there is.
Usually based around foodstuffs. Where they represent other things.
Yeah.
Yes. And asking someone out for a taco could easily be misinterpreted, it turns out. Did you know that? Be careful. Did you know about this? Did you know about this?
Yes, of course.
Where have you been?
I mean, the eggplant kind of looks like, it doesn't even look like an eggplant. It's you know.
And then you've got the peach.
And the peach.
And then if you start adding to that the raindrops and all, you can do anything. Don't act innocent. Don't come here with your,
It's a minefield, clearly.
But do you text? Do you have a smartphone?
I do, yes.
Okay, then I've no idea how that passed you by. That's weird.
Because I thought the emojis were just meant to represent what they represented. I didn't know there was this whole kind of other language you had to learn.
Can you get explicit emojis?
That's what we need. Yes, Apple needs to move forward and just call a vagina a vagina.
So what he's talking about there, and that is David Tennant for any Doctor Who fans in the house, is that the emojis, right, that we use on our phone have a whole other meaning to them than what they are just on the surface. So, as he was saying, the eggplant emoji represents a penis. The peach emoji is a butt. The raindrops, use your imagination. And if you aren't aware of this whole kind of vocabulary that is being communicated with through these emojis, you're missing out on a huge piece of the conversation. And so in our society, when we talk about sexuality, we often talk about it in a kind of a code, right? How many words are there for an arm? An arm is an arm. How many slang words are there for penis? There's a zillion slang words for penis. How many slang words are there for intercourse, sexual intercourse? There are so many. And so for autistic people, trying to, navigate sexuality and relationships is like learning a whole different language. And if you don't have that understanding of this subtextual, way we discuss this topic, you're going to have a very difficult time establishing and maintaining relationships.
There's
So
a whole kind of
Oh, there we go. Okay. So why is it important? Why is it so important for us to talk about this? Well, as we're seeing, as we were saying and we're seeing, sexuality is not assumed to be part of the human experience for autistic people. I always think of an anecdote from Dr. Isabelle Hinault, who's a sexologist working up out of Montreal in Canada. And she talked about working with an autistic young man who was having some erectile challenges. He was having difficulty staying erect. And he was trying so hard to maintain this erection that he was causing physical harm. And it turned out it was a side effect of a medication that he was on. So she went to this young man's doctor and said, why didn't you tell him this was a side effect of the medication, potential side effect? And the doctor said, well, he's not going to have sex. He's autistic. So just this assumption on the part of this ignorant, arrogant doctor ended up resulting in real harm, to this young man. So just that, and all too often I've been at so many conferences in the past where the big three, as I call them, are always addressed, which is housing, employment, and recreation. But relationships and relationship development and sexual health especially is left out of the equation. It's thought of almost as optional, which is mind-blowing to me because it's absolutely not optional. And whether you're someone who engages in sex, or if you're someone who identifies as asexual, these things all matter and are all important to know. Also, this is important because sex begins long before sex begins. Somebody much smarter than me once said that. And what that means is that, people hear the phrase sex education and they get alarmed. They think, you're teaching autistic people how to have sex. Well, no, we're teaching people how to live life, right? We're talking about intimacy, which is something you build with someone long before you're ever thinking about getting in between the sheets with them, right? And intimacy can be many things. Intimacy can be intellectual. It can be, of course, physical. It can be emotional, and intimacy can often look different for autistic people also. But just because it might look different doesn't mean that it's wrong or should be corrected into our narrow prescriptive idea of what intimacy is, right? But all these things go into this equation and into how we conceive, sex and sexuality. It's important also because, as we just saw, communication is paramount. Like I said, if you're someone, and I think something like 80%, I believe it is 75-80% of communication is nonverbal, right? And that's body language, that's nonverbal cues. And if you're someone who has difficulty, right, with reading and understanding those cues, it's going to be very difficult, as I said, to maintain these interpersonal relationships. But at the same time, also, neurotypical people are not great at reading the communication of autistic people. Neurotypical people need to make an effort in addition. I think it should be something where we're meeting halfway, where we're finding each other and finding, ways to not put the burden solely on autistic individuals. But it's also important because the consequences of not providing accurate and comprehensive sex ed are much too great. And of course, the biggest consequence among all these is sexual abuse, without question. And it does occur at far higher rates among disabled and autistic people than non-autistic, but it's not reported as frequently. And why I always try to think about why that might be. Probably, one of the biggest reasons is that we don't teach autistic people what abuse looks like. It can have different topographies, right? It can be physical, it can be sexual, it can be emotional, verbal, financial. But if someone doesn't know they're being abused, if someone doesn't have the language to describe abuse, how can they possibly report it, right? There's also the double stigma. Like I was saying, we've had a Me Too movement in the neurotypical world, but we haven't had a Me Too movement in the autism world. And I think we really need one, right? So many times women, especially, although certainly men are victims of sexual abuse without question. But women very frequently are not believed. And then you add autism into the equation, and it becomes even more challenging, I think. And so it's very easy, again, for the perpetrators to gain the confidence of law enforcement. That's who they're going to side with. Oh, we were just playing a game. Oh, she didn't understand. She was confused. She didn't know what we were doing. So just that creates that many more victims as a result. And finally, I think the other reason it goes underreported is we rely too much on this idea of stranger danger. Overwhelmingly, autistic people are likely to be abused far more by someone who knows us than a stranger, by someone who has access and opportunity, right? So then the question becomes, if the person that you're supposed to rely on and the person you're supposed to trust is the one who's hurting you, then who do you tell? Then what do you do? And of course, the consequences that come with that as well. The loss of trust, the devastation of, this is the person who's supposed to take care of me, but they're hurting me. What do I do with that? How do I handle it? And this just gives you an idea kind of what we're dealing with, in terms of the statistics. Graham Holmes et al., 6.4% of youth with autism in their survey had documented history of sexual abuse. And Brown Lavoie, 78% of respondents reported at least one instance of sexual victimization. If you look at this chart over here, this is, I think, from the National Institutes of Health. I have to double check, but the rate of rape and sexual assault against people with intellectual disabilities and also, I think, developmental disabilities, it's more than 7 times the rate against people without disabilities. And among women, as you can see from below, it's 12 times the rate. That is completely unacceptable. It would not be acceptable if it was even 1 time the rate or twice the rate. The only acceptable rate is 0. And my work, as long as I live, will not ever be done until that number is 0. But just looking at the figures, right, it is really heart-wrenching. And unfortunately, with what we do, especially in schools and especially around compliance-based interventions, we end up creating perfect victims. We'll talk more about that in just a minute and why and what we can do to kind of remedy that. But so a little bit about me, right? You heard about me briefly before, but I am the president of Ascot Consulting, and I'm also a relationship coach in the Rucker Center for Adult Autism Services in New Jersey. I'm a professional speaker. I was recently referred to as the Taylor Swift of autism, which is the first and last time I'll probably ever be compared to Taylor Swift. I was in the film version of In a Different Key, which is based on the New York Times best-selling book by John Donovan and Karen Zucker. I've co-authored a chapter on autism and sexuality with Dr. Peter Gerhardt and Dr. Jess Kauke. Dr. Kauke and I are currently beginning a task force, which the purpose of which is to collect and disseminate information regarding autism and sexual health to medical professionals, because that's such a group of people who really needs more information and better training for working with autistic individuals and patients. I serve on several different boards. I'm a founding member of the Emerging Leaders Initiative at Autism Speaks, and I'm currently writing my first book, which is called The Naughty Audie, which is a memoir of my experiences with dating as a woman on the autism spectrum. But way back, all the way back in the Stone Ages of 1996, I was 13 years old. And like any other, 13-year-old girl, I had crushes. I was going through puberty. My body didn't care that I had autism, right? Our bodies don't care, that we're autistic. I was diagnosed at the age of 11, but I've always been autistic. This is always who I've been. And of course, puberty is the worst time in anybody's life. And there's no exception when you're on the spectrum. But so I was going through those same biological and physical changes as my neurotypical peers. But there was, a disconnect as well. There was a disconnect between, and this kind of was to set the stage for all my experiences with relationships and dating, which is, that theme of disconnect. And even though I was going through puberty, all those same changes, 12, 13 years old, I didn't have my first kiss till I was 17. So that's a big gap, right? So I had so many questions at this age, at 12, 13. So many things I wondered about, had no idea how to ask. And I just had no learning opportunities of any kind to explore my sexuality. Boys were too busy calling me ugly and making fun of me. I didn't go on a single date in high school, so those learning opportunities just that my neurotypical peers had were non-existent for me. And that disconnect manifested further as I was going through puberty. As I say, I often compare it, the way I felt about my body, particularly, to a balloon barely tethered to the earth. That's how I felt. I felt like I was almost floating above myself, but I wasn't really inhabiting my body. I had no self-esteem, because of the bullying I was experiencing. And so when you don't care about your body, that's not a good thing, right? That leaves the door open for someone to come and say, "Oh, I see you. I understand you. You're fine just the way you are," to say all the things that you're desperate to hear when you're 13, 14 years old, but you're not differentiating between who should be saying them to you and who shouldn't. And so that was a really tough thing. And I remember when I had my first menstrual period, I had no idea what was going on until my mother came into the bathroom one day and said, "Oh, you're a woman now." And I was like, "Huh?" Like I had no idea what that meant. And so, the whole conceit of puberty, again, we have a picture of puberty in neurotypical adolescents, but we don't really have a picture of it in autistic individuals. And so, we don't expect a neurotypical 15-year-old to come home and perfectly describe how their entire day was at school in order to believe that maybe they had a bad day at school. We can just believe that. But if an autistic 15-year-old comes home, if they don't say that something bad happened, we don't think anything bad happened. We think that they must be fine, right? And by we, I mean neurotypicals, have a difficult time in envisioning the inner lives of autistic individuals. And that's a problem, right? We have very rich, robust inner lives, but there's just so much misunderstanding around that. And especially around the fact that what we're able to perhaps convey verbally doesn't match up with that richness. And again, that assumption that puberty must not be affecting us the same way it affects our neurotypical peers, which is just not true. Again, with my parents, with all the things we were dealing with trying to get my IEP put into place, with the bullying I was experiencing, we never got to have the talk, the birds and the bees talk. And in my opinion, that's probably best left to the movies. Because sexuality isn't just one talk. It's many discussions throughout the lifetime. And the things I had questions about, when I was 12 and 13, were not the same things I had questions about when I was 17 or when I was 23 or when I was 30 even. Those change over time. We as autistic people can grow and change. There's also this assumption that when someone's diagnosed as autistic, what they are the moment they're diagnosed is what they're going to be forever. And that's not true. We grow and change too, just like everybody else. And so our needs as sexual beings change as well. But again, all those challenges, all the things that I was going through meant that I did not have friends. I was not able to explore my sexuality in the real world. And so I found myself going online. And, the internet was a bit different back then than it is now. Like we didn't have Snapchat and TikTok and, all those things like that, but we did have chat rooms. And I found myself going into Yahoo chat rooms for the Backstreet Boys, and that's where I made friends. And, they say that men watch their porn and women read their porn, and that was certainly true for me. And I began reading erotic fan fiction quite voraciously at this time as a way, again, of exploring my sexuality. And I became sort of the designated writer for my little group of friends. They'd say, "Write me a story, with Kevin." And I'd write a story as far as my virginal 15-year-old imagination could stretch, which in fairness was pretty far. But so even though the internet was different, there were still predators. And I didn't have an understanding or an awareness of that at this particular point in time. And there's a man who came in the chat room one day and he said that he was AJ. And I believed him. I had no reason to think he wasn't who he said he was. Unknown to me, my parents were immediately suspicious. And at the time, they hired a private investigator to look into this person. And he was some guy who lived in Michigan, which is your neighbor state, I believe, right? And, I don't know who he really was. But sort of he sent me a letter, a typed letter, not handwritten, and he sent me a fake diamond ring and all this stuff. And sort of the worst thing that happened was that he asked me to send him a picture of my breasts. And this is before digital cameras, but my parents had one of those flatbed scanners, if anyone remembers the old flatbed scanners that open up like this. And it was on top of our computer desk when people had, computer desks, like in the one computer room in the house. And I stood up on that desk and I hoisted all 85 pounds of myself onto that scanner and I scanned my boobs and I sent them to him. And he proceeded to send the photo to all my friends in the chat room. At the time, I was actually very thrilled. I thought, oh, he liked what he saw so much. Do you want to share it with everybody? This is great. this gives you an indication of where I was mentally at that time, looking for that validation, looking for some kind of approval, and to know that I was okay as I was. And I was totally ecstatic right up until my one friend said, "Oh, Amy, those are your breasts? I thought that they were ears because they were so small." So that kind of destroyed my self-esteem all over again. And I wish I had a little more time with you guys. There was an anecdote I wanted to share that's kind of related to this, but I'm going to try to get through this and make sure we have time for questions. But so, again, because I had, kept having all these, I had such trouble with my real life experiences, that can help you understand why I was online. And so when I was, 15 years old, a boy moved in across the street and he had the cutest freckles I'd ever seen and a bowl haircut that put Julius Caesar to shame. And of course, I developed a crush on him. And what I was talking about earlier about intimacy was what I wanted with him, not physical, but emotional. But I didn't know how to establish that, so I would compensate with physical. So he'd be at the computer, he'd say, "Amy, come here, I want to show you something," and I'd come over and I'd be on top of him, like, "Oh, okay, what is it?" And not realizing that I was in his personal bubble and pissing him off pretty regularly, and then until he finally stopped talking to me. And every time I'd see him across the street, I would wave to him and he would glare at me. And about 50 or 100 waves and glares later, I finally got the message. As I said before, my first kiss wasn't until I was 17. And it was in an ice skating rink in a game of truth or dare, as you do. Again, developed a big crush on this boy. And I remember calling him at home. We didn't go to the same school. So I called him at home and his mother answered the phone. "How dare you call here? Don't you ever call here again." Boom, when you used to be able to slam down receivers. And nobody could explain to me why this woman was so upset that a 17-year-old girl was calling her 14-year-old son. And perhaps, you support autistic individuals, you know that many might get along better with someone who's a bit younger than they are or is older. And that was true for me as well. I never really got on with my same age peers, but no one could tell me why this wasn't okay. And like I said, we didn't go to the same school, so I pretty much never saw him again after that. Senior year, right? So senior year, I have a picture in my head. I want to go to the prom. Prom is going to be it. It's going to be the moment. I've seen She's All That. I'm too young for Pretty in Pink, but I've seen She's All That. And this is going to be my perfect high school moment. And so I had a crush on the boy the whole year long. And he was a junior. The only way the juniors go to the senior prom is with a senior. So I asked him and he said yes. But he was friends with the seniors. I wasn't. And so we had the few kind of obligatory slow dances out on the dance floor, but for the majority of the night, he was busy dancing with other girls, and I was sitting at the table writing poetry on scraps of paper. So I did not get my perfect high school moment. It was yet another disappointment in a long line of disappointments. And again, that idea of that disconnect, right, between what I was trying to do, the relationships I wanted to have, and that were just not happening, no matter how hard I tried. But then, when I was 19, I finally had my first boyfriend. And oh my gosh, we only have 20 minutes. Oh dear me. I have a lot more left. I'll try to get through this quickly. So I didn't know what it meant to be a girlfriend, right? I call him my starter boyfriend because I had no idea what I was doing. We met in a class that we both had, and the next thing I know, bippity boppity boo, we're going out on a date. And I'm meeting his parents and he's meeting my parents. And that disconnect became apparent again in terms of what was expected of me within the context of this relationship versus maybe what I was able to do. And I found myself in this kind of deferential position because he was a year older, more experienced. So I felt that I needed to defer to him. And he was also neurotypical, but that's debatable. But I felt like, well, he knows better than I do. And I'm the one who's cold broken. So that was, again, with my low self-esteem, that was my perception of myself. And he didn't do much to kind of alter that. He would always say things like he was going to dump me for a quote real woman, meaning one with breasts and hips, neither of which I had much of at that time. And he made good. He actually did dump me eventually, not once but twice. And the interesting thing is, after the breakup happened, this is a picture of us, and I cut myself out of this picture. Usually, when someone is dumped or a breakup happens, they cut the other person out of the picture. But this tells you how I perceived myself and how I felt like it was my fault and that I had done something wrong. But I remember that, I believe that we needed to stay friends. I'm very loyal when it comes to friendships, whether I mean to be or not. And even though he became emotionally abusive, I felt like we had to stay friends. And we lived in the same dorm building. So he lived on the first floor with a mutual friend. They were roommates. And I was on the third floor in a solo room. And one night we're out on the front stoop of this building. It's about 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm trying to talk to my friend who's smoking a cigarette. And my ex is like, go away, get out of here. Nobody wants to hear what you have to say, leave us alone. And I'm all like, it's a free country. I have every right to be out here. And he proceeded to physically assault me, which sounds sort of worse than it was, but he slapped my forehead with the back of his hand and he kicked me in the shin. And he was 6'3", and you can't tell because we're on the computer, but I'm 5'0". So it wasn't really an even match in any capacity. And so we get back in the building, and my friend is like, Amy, just go get the RA, tell her what happened. I'll back you up. Just go get the RA. Just go. So I wound up reporting the incident to the RA. I wound up going to the police and filing for a protection from abuse order. Had to go to testify in court. My friend testified on my behalf. I won the order of protection. We had an on-campus hearing with the Dean of Student Affairs. I won that hearing as well. And my ex had to move out of the dorm, no third-party contacts, no email. And I haven't kind of seen or heard from him since, kind of fell off the face of the earth. And it was the most traumatic thing I'd been through up till that point. But it was nothing compared to kind of what was coming next. So when I was 22 years old, I fell in love for the first time. And the thing about being autistic is you often feel that you have to prove that you feel the things you feel, that you know what love is. People think that, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, that you can't possibly understand love if you're someone who's autistic. Not true. But I was very pragmatic about my feelings. I knew that I had loved my college boyfriend, but I wasn't in love with him. And, I always say the two best things he ever did was introduce me to Japanese food and leave me a virgin, which he did. And so, because we did other stuff, but we kind of didn't do that. And so I met this new guy, kind of the worst place you could, which was on a message board for fans of a film director. And this guy lived in Seattle, Washington. I was in college in Pennsylvania. And spring break, senior year of college, I wound up going out to Seattle with some friends, met the guy in person, fell for him even more. And then I wound up moving out there. I moved out there after I graduated, 3,000 miles away from all my friends and all my family. And you often, and I had decided he was the one I wanted to lose my virginity to. Like, I had had other opportunities in college, wasn't ready, and he was who I decided it was going to be. And you often hear that young people think they're invincible and nothing can happen to them. Well, I'm autistic, so everything's happened to me. So I made sure to get on the birth control pill before I moved out there. And I waited the full month you're supposed to wait for the pill to kick in, very rule governed, of course. And I made sure that we had condoms because I didn't want to get pregnant and I didn't want to get an STI, of course. And I'd asked him to wear a white button-down shirt because I'd always wanted to unbutton a guy's shirt when we were going to make love. And I had the bottle of wine picked out and the music burned on the CD. I even purchased a University of Washington Huskies cheerleader uniform because he said he had a thing for cheerleaders. So, we started off the events of the night naked, but partway through, he was having some trouble staying in the mood, if you will. You know what I'm saying. And I said, okay, close your eyes. I have a surprise for you. And I went in the closet and I put the uniform on and I lost my virginity in the University of Washington Huskies cheerleader uniform, which is weird, but that is what happened. But again, here I am at this point of being in love. And, and it's funny as well that when you have rose-colored glasses on, all the flags look red, right? So that it doesn't matter if you're autistic or not. When you're in love, you're stupid. And that was certainly the case for me. But again, I was in that position of low self-esteem and low self-confidence, thinking, if I screw this up, he'll never want to have sex with me again. Nobody will ever want to have sex with me again. And then, so I tried to operationalize it. And I thought, well, back in those days, at least, when you stayed at a hotel or you ate at a restaurant, they had, now it's all online, but they had cards you could fill out to say what your experience was like. So I created a sexual intercourse comment card. And this is the front of the card you see here. I had told my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Peter Gerhardt, about this many years ago. And when I told him, he said, Amy, that's the most autistic thing I've ever heard of. And I think the world would be a better place if more people did this. And so, because there are conversations that you have with a partner, right? There are conversations you have before, during, and after sex. And I did not know how to have those conversations. I didn't understand how to do that. Not that I didn't want to have them. I just didn't know how. So this was my way of kind of making that happen. These are some of the questions. What did you enjoy most about the sex session? What do you think could have been better? Please rate the following from 1 to 5. The outfit I had on, pre-intercourse, my facial expressions, my volume. Is there anything I could do in the future to get you aroused more quickly? Da, da, da. And he did fill it out. He humored me, for whatever reason. But there's a problem with these questions, of course, that I didn't see until many years later with the gift of hindsight. And the problem is that they're all about his pleasure and enjoyment. There's nothing about whether I enjoyed myself. And part of that is, again, being a woman in our society, we're expected to put the needs of others ahead of our own. But part of it was just, again, being a people pleaser, being autistic, wanting to just make him happy because I was in love with him. And that's really what it kind of came down to. And so, but of course, the inevitable followed, as was to follow, which was that 6 months later, after we had had intercourse 8 times, and I did count, he told me he had a girlfriend that he'd forgotten to mention, and he was sleeping with half the women within the city limits of Seattle. And all those other women were calling up his girlfriend and saying how great he was in bed. But I was the one who fell in love with him, so I became the easy target. And when I found all this out, because he was a coward, I found all this out on the phone or online. He never confronted me face to face. There was no face-to-face conversation. And I remember his girlfriend started calling me all hours of the day and night, wanting to know all the details of our conversations, threatened to kill me if I didn't leave town. And he wrote me an email, I think it was at her request, not that it matters, saying, your first time was the grossest thing I ever did. You were just a retarded whore that I effed. You meant nothing to me. Keep thinking we had something, so on and so forth. And I said earlier that I had met him on a message board. His girlfriend went into his account on that message board and posted that email for everybody to read. So this private thing suddenly became a very public thing. That was an 11-page thread of people commenting and saying what a jerk he was and how could he do this. And, he was just sort of ripped out of my life. There was no possible, and nothing could have prepared me for having my heart broken except having my heart broken. But it was that very experience that taught me that I could get through it. It was that very thing that taught me, that I was stronger than I ever realized I was, because I remember he sent me a message a few months after the harassment finally ended, and he said, sorry for ruining your life. And there were a lot of things that had gone through me, when this was all happening. I felt hurt, I felt heartbroken, sad. But when he said that to me, I felt an emotion that I had not felt up until then, which was anger. Righteous, full, clear-headed anger. And I thought, how dare you give yourself that much credit? You didn't ruin my life. I'm still here. And I'm still here. And I would say, I don't know that you ever get over something like this, but you do move on. And it took, I would think, about 7 years for me to fully move on from what happened. And so that was but it was a huge learning experience, more than anything. But in thinking about that, right, and thinking about the experiences that I've had in my life, the question I sought to answer as a professional was, how can we help autistic people learn dating and sexuality skills? Maybe not to prevent people from having their hearts broken, but to perhaps be able to better deal with it than I was, and to be able to navigate all of this, with much more precision and just knowledge overall. And so, much of the current research literature that talks about autism and sexuality, and there's still not that much, we really need a lot more, but a lot of it is anecdotal. And anecdotal, is talking to people about their experiences and cataloging those experiences, and that's great. That's really, really important. But we haven't had as much that focuses on teaching skills. That's beginning to change, right? We are starting to see skill development for autistic individuals in the area of dating and sexuality, but the need is just overwhelming at this particular point. And very often when a teacher is asked to address sexual behavior in school, some of you might know this from your own experiences, it's usually to stop something, to decrease a behavior, but not to teach something, right? And we can't have one without the other. We can't just stop something, tell someone don't do this, without telling somebody what they should do instead. And that's really important. And it's also important for us to be proactive instead of reactive, which we'll talk more about in just a minute. But why is there this reluctance, right? Why is there a hesitation to address dating and sexuality skills for autistic people? Like I was saying, we have these preconceived ideas, right? We have an idea of what autism is. And for many people, that idea of autism does not involve sex. It does not involve sexuality, being a sexual being, but we are human beings. And this is part of who we are, right? And again, that infantilization piece that I mentioned earlier about this idea of autistic people as perpetual children, even as adults, and we're not. Autistic children become autistic adults. That's kind of what happens. And you know what? It beats the hell out of the alternative, in my opinion, okay? But again, another reason why we're hesitant is, again, the focus on compliance, right? The fact that we're always thinking about making sure that autistic people are where we need them to be, when we need them to be there, doing what we need them to do. But we can't have people who will just go off with somebody who says that they're an authority, because as we said, that's inadvertently creating perfect victims, right? So non-compliance is a social skill as well, and it's a safety skill. Teaching someone, when and how to say no is just as important as teaching someone to say yes, maybe even more so, right? So we have to stop kind of focusing so much on this idea of compliance and getting autistic people to do everything that we want them to do, because selective non-compliance matters. And it can be a matter of life and death in certain cases. Another reason there tends to be a hesitance is that we don't know how to teach these skills. People think that you need to be an expert on something in order to teach it. I hate that word, and I'll tell you why. Because to me, the word expert confers with it a static authority that can't be challenged. And we're learning so much all the time about sexuality. We're learning so much all the time about autism. So anybody who says that they have all the answers is either not very smart or they're lying, right? So I call myself a specialist for that reason. And I think the most powerful phrase you can say sometimes is, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but let's find out together. I've said that to clients that I've worked with, because it's important to show that even the people who are in the positions of trying to teach this stuff, we're still learning too. And that's okay. That is okay. But trying, even if you don't have a perfect answer, is better than not trying at all. Dare to give a damn is what I call it. And then finally, again, I think we hesitate because there's this fear of consequences, right? We're when we talk about sexuality and dating skills, we're talking about something that carries an inherent risk, right? Somebody might, get their heart broken, or they might end up being in a relationship that's maybe not so healthy, or they might, but we as autistic people have the right to what I call the dignity of risk, which means, that all these things, for neurotypicals, they get to go out and take risks, and they get to fall down, and that's how they learn to get back up again. And we should have that same opportunity as autistic people. We cannot be held in a box and have everything prevented from happening to us, because then nothing will ever happen to us. And that's not how the world works. So, in thinking about all this, I have a master's degree in applied behavior analysis, and my thesis study was focused around teaching individuals on the spectrum how to ask someone out on a date. And I wanted to continue that work as part of my role at Rutgers. And so I decided to develop a sex ed curriculum called the ASK, the Adult Autism and Sexuality Kit. And so the rationale, like we just said, the fact that we didn't have a lot of quantitative research, that there's this reinforcing idea of stereotypes, that there's not a need for a sex ed curriculum. And most existing sex ed curricula that are out there are usually created by neurotypicals for autistic people, and they don't always include facets of autistic communication, which we'll talk more about in just a moment. This is my team. Without them, this would never have happened. Dr. Vanessa Ball, who's the director of the Lifespan ASD lab at Rutgers, she was my main collaborator. It would never have happened without her. Dr. Erin Lipsack was also at the Lifespan lab, and Genta Kukaj, who's a research assistant. We applied for a grant in 2022. It was my first grant as a principal investigator. I don't know whose brilliant idea that was, but got the grant, and we started reviewing Answer. Answer is the oldest sex ed curriculum in the country, and it's housed at Rutgers. So we wanted to kind of build on what already existed and see what we could use and what we could modify for autistic individuals. And we conducted stakeholder interviews. We looked at the National Sexuality Education Standards, which cover 7 main content areas. So we had the people in the interviews. Most of them were autistic adults, but we also had parents of autistic individuals. We had them rank those content areas and say which they thought was the priority for a curriculum like this. So like I said, we modified those plans and we created original content. Genta was instrumental in this. She created original characters that we had, which were so crucially important to this. And we ultimately decided to focus on preparedness for sex specifically, because this is such a massive area, right? You can't just create a sex ed curriculum, especially within the limited scope of a grant period, and hope to cover everything that there is. It's just not going to happen. So we decided to hone in on preparedness for sex through the lens of healthy relationships and personal safety, which were the 2 content areas from those national sexuality standards that were ranked as the 2 most important. We covered a lot of different areas. Consent was a huge one, but and sensory challenges, because one of the biggest things autistic individuals face in this particular area is navigating the sensory challenges of sex, smells and sensations and noises and all those kinds of things. And we tried to incorporate, again, as we said, autistic communication. What is the way? This is what might be expected from neurotypicals, right? We would say that, but then how can we look at your communication style as an autistic person to help you achieve that goal in a way that works for you? So that really, I think, made a huge difference. And ultimately, this is meant to be a foundation, as we're saying. We don't want this to be like an encyclopedia sitting on the shelves. We want it to develop and to be informed by the population that we're trying to serve. So at the moment, the goal right now is to package this curriculum. It's not currently in a packaged form, so I really want it to be, and then be able to distribute that and sell that to members of the field, professionals in the field, and the public. But kind of the biggest, of course, piece, the idea is to create conversations, right? How do we start that conversation when for so many people, just beginning to talk about sexuality and autism is so hard? So what can you do? What can you right now, as someone working with autistic individuals that you support, how can you begin this process? As we were saying, right, that the most basic thing is to acknowledge the sexual needs and desires of autistic people. You might be thinking, well, duh, of course. But if people were already doing this, I wouldn't have to say it. All too often, especially when it comes to behavior, behaviors are either ascribed as always being sexual in nature or they're never sexual. For some reason, there's no in between when it comes to autistic individuals. Someone, for example, a young man having an erection in the middle of the school day doesn't mean that someone is sexually aroused. That's the body just doing what the body does. Young men, especially going through puberty, will have spontaneous erections, which is it's basically the body making sure the plumbing is working. That's kind of what that is, but it's not necessarily correlated to sexual arousal. Conversely, behavior that is, people will kind of just ignore that it might well be. And so when we don't acknowledge autistic people as sexual beings, it becomes very easy to go down that slippery slope and deny people the right to sex education. Right, because we will say, well, it's not sexual. This is an autistic person. They're not interested in sex, so we don't need to give them sex education. And that is possibly the worst thing that we could do. Again, thinking about what does this person want? I've had so many times where clients feel like, I want a girlfriend. Okay, well, what does that mean? You can't go down to the girlfriend shop and buy one. Like, we got to think about, what does that mean? What is your specific goal here? What do you want from a relationship? What can you bring to a relationship? Right? That's something that many, people don't think about. Because it's not just about being in a relationship and getting all the benefits of having a partner or a girlfriend or boyfriend. It's what do you bring? And for many autistic people, they don't always know. Right? When you spend your whole life with everybody telling you who you are, how do you have the opportunity to kind of figure out who you are for yourself? And so that's a really important thing, is helping someone, empowering someone to be able to make those choices and figure out who they are and what they want from a relationship. And as I was saying before, knowing what you don't know. If you are working, like I said, with an interdisciplinary team of other professionals who are supporting autistic individuals, you have other people whose knowledge base you can tap into. And that's important, right? This mostly tends to go to the BCBAs out there when I give this presentation to. There's this idea that they got to be the big experts in the room. And I'm like, you don't have to be the expert. You got all these other people, right, who know stuff and who are supporting the same person that you are. Listen to each other, right? Listen, communicate, collaborate. So yes, so we will get to that, Kathleen. I do have some further on down. Thank you for that question. We don't have any parents here today, so I'll skip this one. But at school, right? Like I said, knowing your role with the child's team, right? What role do you have? And as a teacher, if you're a what you call a general ed teacher, that doesn't make you any less someone's teacher than of any of your other students, right? A student on the spectrum might have others who support them, whether that's a paraprofessional, OT, whatever that might be. But as a teacher, you have just an important role, and that student is just as much your student. The idea of being open to questions, right? Your students, you might find that students ask all kinds of questions you don't expect. We're talking about, let's say, neurotypical students right now. For an autistic student, they may have questions as well. It may take them time to find a way to ask those questions, or they might ask them in a way that is not expected. But if you become someone that your student feels comfortable asking those questions to, that's huge, right? Just letting them know, hey, I'm here. Like, if you have a question or you just want to talk, like, that's cool. That makes a huge difference, and will make a huge difference in that child's life. And of course, getting buy-in from all stakeholders, right? This is not up to just the teacher either. Like, we we have to, we have to get the buy-in from administrators, buy-in from, that's often the hardest part, right? I mean, my parents are retired teachers, so I have so much respect and admiration for teachers. I have less respect for administrators, knowing what my parents have been through. And what you all, I'm sure, go through, right? But it's so important, in this case, to get that buy-in and to, and also with parents also of why it's important for sex education to take place. Incidentally, I do parent trainings also. So if you have parents who are reluctant to have their child receive sex education, send them my way, or let's set up a training, and I'll be happy to talk to them, because all too often parents think of their child as their child, whether their child is on the spectrum or not. It's very difficult to think of your child as a sexual being, and then you add autism into it, and that becomes even more the case. But I have found that when I talk to parents, that they'll say to me, hearing you, now I see my child as a person, not just as my child, right? And that's a huge thing. But it just takes that first step to get there. Again, I don't think we have any parents today, right? But these are all important things as well, right? Earlier definitely is better, reinforcing boundaries. So that's a hugely important thing. If there are boundaries that you wouldn't cross with a neurotypical student, why would you cross those boundaries with an autistic student, right? I'm talking about things like hugging and kissing students, which we see happen very often, right? If you would not hug and kiss a neurotypical 14-year-old, why are you going to hug and kiss an autistic 14-year-old who might still be getting the same thing out of it that a neurotypical 14-year-old would? So just really important things to keep in mind. I know we're running out of time. I apologize. We're almost done. So what should sex education mean ultimately for autistic people, whether it's in the home or at school, right? It means safety, right? Because when we talk about safety, that's kind of the big thing that often comes up when we talk about sex education and autism. But to keep people safe, you need to empower them. That's the best way to do it, is to give people knowledge, right? To reinforce ideas of bodily autonomy, who can touch you, who can't touch you, to reinforce the ideas of boundaries, right? And that's something that can start just so young. Like, your body is yours. Nobody gets to touch you without your permission. And you don't have to kiss, like, you take a kid to grandma's house. Okay, give grandma a kiss. I don't want to kiss grandma right now. Well, too bad. You have to kiss grandma. You'll hurt her feelings. But that tells someone from a very early age that their feelings don't matter, that they have to appease others, right? We don't want that. That's something that is like so important and can start from that earlier point, right? So giving someone that knowledge, knowing that they're in control of their body and their boundaries matters. Again, we also tend to talk a lot about prevention when we're talking about sex education, preventing unwanted pregnancies, preventing other consequences. But pleasure is such a big piece of this as well, right? We forget that people have sex because it feels good. That's why the species has been doing it for thousands and thousands of years. So giving someone the tools to be able to know what they enjoy, what they don't enjoy, will also help to keep someone safe ultimately, because they'll know, hey, I don't like the way that feels, But I remember for me, with my boyfriend in college, he would do stuff when we were being intimate, and it wasn't really doing anything for me, or I just didn't like it, and I would say that, and he'd say, well, all the other girls I've been with like that, so I thought there was something wrong with me. I thought that I was broken, right? But and that I had to find a way to try to enjoy it. And that's not okay. That was a violation of my boundaries, but I didn't think that my boundaries mattered. And so that's and I didn't know my body well enough to know and have that sense of self-confidence to say, hey, no, just don't do that, but also finding ways to help autistic individuals make their own reproductive choices, right? We unfortunately have a very long history in this country of forced sterilization against disabled and autistic people. We have, and I still get questions when I do these talks from people wanting to know about, should I have my child, should I have them undergo a surgery to stop puberty, to make it easier? I'm like, make it easier for who? Exactly. Like what? Like, no, like that's not, and it's such a slippery slope. I remember I have to just say this because I gave this talk a year ago or so to a medical group, and this man came up to me afterward who was a urologist. And this conference was in California, yet he was from New Jersey as well, coincidentally. And very casually, he says to me that he has a son who's autistic and had intellectual disabilities, and the son has a friend who's also autistic and ID. And he performed a vasectomy on the son's friend without the young man's permission or consent. And he just says it to me so matter-of-factly, like this is the most normal thing in the world. And I'm like, what do I say to this? I mean, I couldn't even form the words really. But if we try to take those choices away from people, we're causing so much more harm than we could ever hope to imagine. And then ultimately, what sex education should mean is sexuality, but without shame, right? There are some things that go really well together. Starsky and Hutch, peanut butter and jelly, sex and shame, not so much, right? We don't want to put those things together. And I think we as autistic people don't naturally feel a sense of shame around sex until we're told to feel ashamed. So being able to have these conversations and answer people's questions without shaming someone is so hugely important. And it's going to go a long way to ensuring that autistic people are healthy and have good, healthy attitudes towards sex. Someone asked about other curricula, and here there are a few that are out there. Elevated training was developed by Catherine McLaughlin. This was, she is physically disabled, so it was initially more geared toward individuals with physical disabilities, but it's also geared toward people with developmental disabilities as well and intellectual disability. So this is a great curriculum that's out there. Also the Hearts curriculum out of Boston University. I consider them almost a sister curriculum to my Ask curriculum because they focus more on relationship development. And so that's very important, obviously. But preparedness for sex is also important. But I think we can't have one without the other. But so I think that they're really great in covering that. So those are some that are existing out there, and like I said, more are starting to exist. There's also the Sex Ed for Self Advocates. This is from the Organization for Autism Research. It's free and available online. It's for individuals ages 15 and up, and it covers everything, from hygiene to dating to abuse, sexual orientation. All of that stuff is in there. And I recorded the introductions to all the sections along with Dr. Peter Gerhardt. So this is a curriculum I'm really very proud of. And also Sexuality and Disability from Alberta Health Services in Canada. It says it's a guide for parents, but I think it's great for professionals too. And it's sex positive and LGBTQ inclusive. So I really enjoy it as a resource for that reason. And there are also some dating sites that are out there now for autistic adults. Again, you always need to do research when you're looking at online dating. Obviously, there's a lot of people out there who misrepresent themselves. But these sites, I think, are all paid sites, which is a safety measure to ensure that people aren't going on and pretending to be autistic if they're not. I'm a little gun shy about online dating, because of my experiences, but these are also great for making friends, not just for dating also. And eHarmony has a whole section on its website about online dating safety tips, which I think are very helpful, whether you're on the spectrum or not. I think they could be modified really well for autistic individuals. So, but it's good to know that these are options that are out there. It might not be for everyone. I'm not saying it is. There's also another organization called Relation Spot, which is based in New York. I can't remember if they might have some online things, but they're kind of a matchmaking service for autistic individuals. That's more for adults, I suppose. But these things are starting to exist now, which is a really great thing because they never did before. So a few final guidelines, just as we wrap up here, and thanks for hanging on with me here. We're more alike than we're different, right? When we think of autism, right, we think of differences. We think of something that's an other. But that's where we tend to place autistic people, is in this other category. But we're human beings, right? And even though we're autistic, we have a lot of things in common with neurotypicals. And nowhere, perhaps, do I think we have more in common than actually in the area of sexuality. Because the truth of the matter is, neurotypicals don't know what they're doing either. Neurotypicals have no idea what they're doing when it comes to sex and dating, but they're able to fake it better. But then, because we don't talk about these things openly, it makes us all feel like we're inadequate somehow. But if we moved the conversation to where we're talking about these things, freely, we can share in that common humanity, and we can show that nobody has all the answers, right? That we're all just kind of stumbling along, and maybe that'll make it easier for all of us in the end. Again, this idea of assuming competence. When we talk about competence, again, people tend to think that carries an intellectual component to it. Competence can occur regardless, I believe, of whether someone has intellectual disability or not. But competence shouldn't be mistaken for comprehension either, right? So the concepts and the things that we talk about when it comes to sexuality and sexual health, those can be understood on a mental, and it's easy to regurgitate or repeat back information, but then applying information in a real world setting is often where the challenges end up lying, right? So being able to comprehend this information on that deeper level and apply it and generalize it across settings, that's often where the challenges really lie. But just because that's a challenge someone might have doesn't mean that we don't teach these skills to begin with. It just means that we have more work to do. And we owe it to autistic individuals to do that work and to not give up. And finally, believe that autistic individuals deserve exceptional quality of life. There's a word that I'm beginning to hate, which is adequate, right? Well, we need to ensure that autistic people have adequate supports and adequate. How often do we hear that? But adequate is never adequate enough. It just isn't. And if we would not allow not adequate enough care for neurotypical individuals, it should be the same for autistic people, right? If we want the best for neurotypical individuals, why don't we want the best for autistic individuals too? Don't we deserve that? So, the foundation on which you provide support is just as important as the support you're providing, right? If you go into work and you look at the student in front of you and you think, well, I just got to get through this day and this doesn't really matter. And this student's been having such a hard time. Like that is going to affect how you provide the supports that you're providing, right? And when it comes to sexuality, especially if you think, oh, well, this person's not really going to need to know this and they're not going to, have sex and all this, then that's going to affect the way you provide that information. So these things matter. The attitude that we have matters. And that's something, if nothing else, I hope you take that with you from this presentation today. So thank you all so much for your time and attention. This is my contact information. If you scan the QR code, it'll take you to my socials, Instagram, LinkedIn, and so forth. And now we can go to questions. Oh, thank you, Natasha. I see in the chat there. Thank you so much for this, Amy, especially your amazing resources and your incredible sharing about your experiences. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I'm glad that it was helpful. I'll stop sharing my screen so you can see me. Okay. So any other questions from anybody? I don't have any filter that I'm aware of, so you can ask anything you like. It's okay, and it'll stay here. Well, thanks, Melanie, very much. You guys are quiet today. You, me.
I valued very much so the kind of comment there at the end of the similarities are much greater than the differences. And I don't know, that was very humanizing and I think challenges a lot of those kind of preconceived notions um of just difference. So I thought that was really well done. Your humor and
Thank
wit
you.
made an uncomfortable topic easier to discuss. That I think is also very true.
Oh, I'm glad. But that's the whole idea, right? That's any suggestions on how to present this material in a public high school? Yeah, hire me to do it. I'll do it. That's what I'm here for. I consult and I present in schools. Um, Again, it's all. Oh, you mean to students? Do you mean to students or to other staff? Are we talking staff training? Or are we talking to students? Julie, if you could just clarify. To students, okay. Um, Well, I mean, you could do it in groups, but then you could offer opportunities for individual discussion. I didn't use this tool tonight because we're virtual, but I use a tool sometimes called Slido, which it'll put a QR code up on the screen and people can scan it and they can ask questions on their phone and they can ask them anonymously. So if they're not comfortable asking something, they can ask using that app and they don't have to raise their hand and their name won't be attached to it. And that might make it a little bit easier. I think yeah, I mean, you could definitely gauge and see if people would be, you could also ask, like, would the students be more interested in hearing about this as a group or would they want to talk one-on-one? I think a group presentation is a good starting point and then just leaving room open for individual discussions. But I do student presentations also. So that is something that I also do. I hope that helps. You're welcome.
Okay, thank you so much. I think there's a lot to chew on as well as those extra resources that were in your slideshow. Just for reference, everyone, this webinar will be able to be found soon on the ATTA webinar page on the ATTA website, and the slides will also be available on the website linked there. So feel free to keep an eye out for that. I'll try to get that up the next day or two. So. Thank you again, Amy, for your time, your experience, your knowledge, and thank you all for participating and going out from here with what you learned. So thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Mhm.